I love it, and I think I always will. What I don't love is how queerness is talked about not just within the it fandom, but in articles about it. I view those conversations as a microcosm of an overarching problem of queer people and characters being reduced to who exactly they love instead of the assortment of queer experiences, instead of truly celebrating queerness instead of just accepting it. Much of the conversation I've seen online regarding Richie Tozier's queer coding regards Eddie Kaspbrak. I want to unpack Richie Tozier's queerness outside of other characters, including Eddie Kaspbrak, specifically as it relates to unpalatability and moral panics that existed deeply in the 1950s and transformed by the mid-1980s. I'm not going to talk about werewolves or cheek kisses, but instead another Richard. A smaller Richard. Little Richard. Tyina Steptoe writes in Big Mama Thornton, Little Richard, and the Queer Roots of Rock and Roll, quote, Little Richard recorded Tutti Frutti in 1955. The song rose to number 17 on the pop charts, but the popularity of Little Richard's recording was eclipsed by Pat Boone's cover version, which reached number 12. Little Richard rooted Boone's rise in racial politics. They needed a rock star to block me out of white homes because I was a hero to white kids. The white kids would have Pat Boone up on the dresser and me in the drawer because they liked my version better, but the families didn't want me because of the image I was projecting. End quote. What Steptoe, and Little Richard, notice is a moral panic. An article from the University of Southern Indiana says about moral panics, a term coined by sociologist and criminologist Stanley Cohen, quote, he, Stanley Cohen, used it when he was talking about mods and rockers. They had rumbles with the rockers, the subculture that was into early American rock and roll, whereas the mods were more into cutting-edge R&B and the new British rock and roll. They had fights, and the British media glommed onto that, and probably made it scarier than it actually was. Stanley Cohen said this was an example of moral panics, where respectable adult society is freaked out by something new in culture. Usually that new thing in culture is associated with young people and perceived threats to its cultural identity, end quote. In the case of Little Richard, it's related to his image, a black man who is also gender nonconforming. None of that is palatable, especially not in the 1950s. Steptoe elaborates on this image and how it affected Little Richard. Quote, the post-war political climate led to backlash against queerness, which affected the ways that black artists could express gender nonconformity by the mid-1950s. Anti-communist propaganda promoted the heteronormative American family as the best way to uphold national values. Any deviation from the norm was subversive and could undermine American democracy, end quote. I then look to Derry, Maine. While capitalism and communism aren't outright stated in it, besides the word pinko, the status quo is there. Every single main character deviates from the norm. Beverly is poor, Stan Jewish, Eddie viewed as chronically ill due to his mother's treatment of him, Mike is black, Ben is fat, Bill has a stutter, and Richie talks a lot, and he has glasses. But really, Richie is proudly unpalatable, even if it's less easy to quickly name than it is with the other characters. While his peers may try to change, like Ben losing all the weight, Richie doesn't, but we'll get to that later. Derry is America. It is heteronormative, it doesn't like pinkos or gay people or black people. It praises Protestantism and the good, hard-working American family. Richie, on the other hand, an 11-year-old scrawny kid who can't get a tan to save his life, likes rock and roll, a genre forged by black musicians, and he likes those black musicians. His mother does not. More specifically, she does not like Jerry Lee Lewis, Freddie Cannon, Chuck Berry, and Little Richard. Richie Tozier likes those guys. He also likes Frankie Ford, and Eddie Cochran, and Fats Domino, and Buddy Holly, and Screaming Jay Hawkins, and the Devils. Richie really likes rock and roll. He, as a kid, wants to go to a rock and roll show he sees advertised at the Derry City Center. The presenter is meant to be Arnie Woo-Woo Ginsburg, who, like Richie, even though it isn't mentioned in the text, wears glasses. More than that, he's a disc jockey, which is what Richie grows up to be. And even more importantly, most importantly of all, he spent 4 decades in a relationship with a man. Richie doesn't just like rock and roll stars and their culture, he wants to be like them. I think more about the broad moral panic of rock and roll written about in the earlier mentioned University of Southern Indiana article. Quote, one of the first moral panics associated with the first wave of rock and roll was the fear of race mixing. That young black and white kids would get together over this music that had a rhythmic, primitive, sensuous beat. Suburban moms and dads are freaked out about their daughters hanging out with young black men listening to sexualized music. There's a long, ugly history in America over the fear of race mixing and lynching black men because of their perceived desire for white women. To have young, teenage white girls in America screaming to someone like Little Richard as he's singing, "Good golly, Miss Molly, you sure like to ball, when you're rocking and rolling, can't hear your mama call," that was brand new in the American experience, and it freaked a lot of people out. It was a moral panic about sexuality and race mixing, end quote. When I read this, I thought again about how Richie both adores and wants to be a rock and roll star. He's this young boy who is incredibly enthusiastic about rock and roll, this sexualized genre. He knows his mother's opinions on it, to the point where he knows asking her to go to the show is pointless because she will 100% say no. In a separate scene, she tells him and his father, Wentworth, to tone down their vulgarity. Vulgarity is exactly how rock and roll and the stars and the presenters were viewed. This is no longer just about race, but about queerness. A young boy who likes Little Richard. A flamboyant black man who his mother does not like. Richie both idolizes these men, Buddy Holly and presumably Arnie Ginsberg, and he likes listening to them. He thinks in the chapter The Smoke Hole that he's going to one day be a rock and roll star, that he'll be famous in spite of wearing glasses. He gains clarity and peace from this thought. He wants to see them, be amazed by them, like he is the Paul Bunyan statue that ends up turning into Buddy Holly, who he's compared to. He says, as an adult, that he was, quote, as amazed by its cheerful vulgarity now as he had been overwhelmed by its size as a child, end quote. That cheerful vulgarity is very much how the music of Buddy Holly was. Richie, like rock and roll music, is vulgar, but far more outright than the music on the radio. He talks about sex and swears, and people attempt to make him shut up, like the radio stars, especially during the whole payola scandal, but unlike them, he doesn't quiet down. He doesn't become palatable. Stephen Mintz writes in his article, Rewriting the History of Rock and Roll, about Vincent L. Stevens' dissertation, Queering the Textures of Rock and Roll History, and further writes about the concept of spectacularizing and self-infreaking. Spectacularizing referring to over-the-top appearance, or in Richie's case, personality, and self-infreaking being to make yourself purposefully different, almost to the point of pointing it out. Richie does both. He self-infreaks by spectacularizing his personality via his voices, large gestures, and constant swearing. Once again, Richie Tozier in no means attempts to make himself palatable. Rather, he becomes weirder as a way to deal with his emotions, mainly mental overdrive. Stephen King writes about Richie Tozier in Chapter 11, Walking Tours, that, quote, he had realized now that a lot of the problem had been of his own mind, which was usually moving at a speed 10 or 20 times that of his classmates. They thought him strange, weird, or even suicidal, depending on the escapade in question. But it had been a simple case of mental overdrive. If anything about being in constant mental overdrive was simple, end quote. His unpalatability is part of him, that he cannot silence without going into further overdrive. And Richie's way of dealing with that mental overdrive is to be loud, strange, and queer. But once again, Richie's strangeness somehow sneaks through and makes him famous. In an article for Texas Monthly about Buddy Holly, Robert Draper writes, quote, while Elvis's gyrations were inducing panic in the world, Buddy was slipping hedonism through the front door like a bouquet proffered by a happy-faced delivery boy. His was a triumph of subversion, but how such a feat grew out of a perfectly ordinary boyhood in Lubbock is an astounding mystery, one that no one has ever come close to solving, end quote. While this article was written decades after King's It, there's still a relevance I find within it all. In the midst of the Cold War's incessant push for palatability, Holly found a way to sneak in and subvert expectations. Richie Tozier is parallel to Holly through their glasses. King writes in Chapter 11 about the giant statue of Holly, quote, one bow of Buddy's glasses had been mended with adhesive tape, end quote, just like Richie's glasses. Despite this, I can't help but think again about Arnie Ginsberg, a disc jockey, like Richie Tozier. The question of why Richie is the way he is continues to show itself throughout King's novel. As memory fades, Richie doesn't find the answer to why he is the way he is, But in the end, once his memory has come back, he knows well enough. For Richie, and lots of queer people, perhaps it isn't really a perfectly ordinary childhood, but rather one that has been merely forgotten. Perhaps the success is really just a stroke of luck. Perhaps the Losers Club's success isn't in spite of their palatability, but because of it. Maybe, just maybe, they really are special. And maybe they are just like the 1990 miniseries describes them. The Lucky Seven. But luck doesn't stop fear. Richie Tozier is 38 in 1985, and the rock show he dreamed of going to as a child has come back to haunt him. The unpalatability is back to haunt him. And this time, he's the presenter, taking Arnie Ginsberg's spot, and all of his performers who he dreamed of being are dead. Rock and roll was seen as a danger when he was a child due to its supposed risk of upending American values. But at Richie Tozier's all-dead rock show, the danger isn't sex and unpalatability, it's about death. As a child, he was afraid of being bullied for being different in a way that would stunt him from being able to be successful. But now he's made a living off of that unpalatability. He's unpalatable and it's profitable. He didn't become the norm, he's stayed weird, having interviewed a newer beacon of moral panic in the 1980s, Ozzy Osbourne. Now, the fear isn't that his difference will mean he gets bullied, but that his differences have doomed him. That luck isn't enough. You can still end up, just like Buddy Holly.